All right, welcome everybody to this lunch hour session on the history of protest in India. We'll get started and we'll be joined by more. My name is Shahan Mufti. I'm a professor in the Department of Journalism at the University of Richmond, and I'm also this year a faculty fellow in international education. And I am honored and excited to introduce our guests who will be in conversation today. So I'll introduce the guest from closer to home, Yucel Yanikdag is a professor of history and global studies at the University of Richmond, and he'll be hosting and moderating the event today. Professor Yanikdad's area of expertise are around the First World War, and his first book, Healing the Nation, Prisoners of War, Medicine and Nationalism in Turkey, was published in 2013. He's twice awarded the Fulbright Hays Fellowship, and he held the George F. Kennan membership at the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton. And now for our guest from a little farther away in Delhi, India today, Raghu Karnad is a journalist and writer who was recently awarded the prestigious Wyndham Campbell Prize by Yale University. He helped launch the news website TheWire.in in 2015 that is, I'll say as a journalist and a professor of journalism has quickly become recognized as one of the most exciting and dynamic places for news on India all around the world. His first book, Farthest Field, an Indian story of the Second World War, was an excavation of his family's history to tell the larger story of British Indian soldiers who fought the Second World War. Raghu will start us off with opening comments on the subject of the day, history of protest in India. And as we were talking, it's a subject that resonates loudly on campus today and at this time. And of course, India is the place where many American civil rights leaders in the 20th century found inspiration for their own work. Um, and then Professor Yanikdag and Raghu will then engage in a conversation about some of the ideas presented. And I expect that maybe Yucel, as a historian of the Ottoman Empire, there might even be some space to talk about maybe some of the parallels between present day Turkey and India, perhaps. And finally, we will dedicate the last 20 minutes or so of today's session to audience questions. So I will now hand over to Raghu Karnad for his opening remarks. Raghu, it's a real honor and a pleasure to have you today with us. All yours.
Thank you, Shahan. Thank you. The honor is mine, and thank you everyone for joining on what I realize is a very gripping day on campus when it must be difficult to be sitting at your computers. But I want to say that I'm aware of what's happening, and I really wish you all well with that. And hopefully that some of what we talk about this afternoon will feel relevant and might even enrich some of the conversations you're having on campus. So, history of protest in India. It might seem like quite an unfamiliar story to some of you, but there are at least a couple of names that I'm sure you're familiar with that I'll mention. One of them is Mahatma Gandhi, and one of them is Martin Luther King, and one of them is the hip hop artist Rihanna. And in case you watch Hindi films or are familiar with Bollywood at all, you might know another name that that comes up in India's history of protest, and that is the film star Deepika Padukone, who's sort of possibly the most famous and most popular movie actress in the country. She's sort of like India's Jennifer Lawrence. So what did Rihanna and and Deepika Padukone have to do with this story? Well, let's start there. India is currently in the middle of an enormous farmers' protest, a protest by farmers' unions that have in fact spent much of the last couple of months surrounding the national capital of Delhi and blocking off some of the major highways leading into the city. And what the farmers are protesting is something we can come back to. It has to do with a sort of with an agricultural with a system of agricultural prices that keep a lot of farmers well supported. But what's more important is that the government hasn't really given them much space to protest and has pushed back very hard on their right to even protest this at all. What happened on February 2nd is that Rihanna, who you know and who literally everyone knows, tweeted a single line sort of in support of the Indian farmers' protest. She said, "Why aren't we talking about this?" And naturally, that tweet went very, very viral. So far, that's uncontroversial. But the Indian government's response and the Indian establishment's response to that was to claim that Rihanna had fallen into an international conspiracy to defame India, and one that was sort of being hatched by seditionists to sort of undermine the country's progress. And Rihanna got dragged into this, though I'm sure she is doing just fine. Another person who got dragged into this was someone else who's tweeted in support of the protests, Greta Thunberg. And one of her young associates in India, a climate activist named Desha Ravi, not a member of a farmers' union by any means, but someone who felt solidarity for this protest movement, has ended up facing a sedition case, an extremely serious set of criminal charges, just for her involvement in coordinating a kind of an online toolkit to raise international awareness about the farmers' protests. So that was Rihanna, and that was just a couple of weeks ago. A year ago, in the same season, India was in the grip of another very massive protest, and this one was one that I followed extremely closely. I think that it's one that might hold some of the future of this country and the fate of this country in its hands. And this was a protest movement that was centered on Muslim Indians and on working class Muslim Indian women in particular, which is one of the things that made it extraordinary, against a set of new citizenship laws and a citizenship agenda, which was beginning to specifically exclude Muslims from the vision of Indian citizenship and was threatening to potentially leave an untold number of Muslim Indians stateless at some point in the future. Students were at the forefront of these protests, and there was a lot of fairly brutal violence against students. And on one of these days, a campus was attacked, and Deepika Padukone, one of the most popular film stars of the country, showed up in solidarity with the student leaders who had been assaulted, and was promptly reviled and denounced by the national establishment, including on media. And by the end of the year, Deepika, who otherwise seems like sort of like a celebrity in another realm and beyond mortal kind of consequences, was actually being dragged around by the National Crime Bureau to answer in an investigation for whether or not she had ever bought weed or smoked weed. So she was also paying the price for supporting protests. And, I don't want to highlight just the two most privileged people in the history of to ever graze the history of Indian protest, but what I'm trying to put across is that in the current climate in India, protest is a right that's increasingly difficult to carry out, and even people with amazing protections and privileges are facing a lot of fire for showing solidarity. And the broader thing that is true is that people in power are always ready to describe protest, and even peaceful and constitutional protest movements, as being dangerous. And as we're seeing around here very often, and in many places in the world, it is a routine of governments to call peaceful, legal protest movements anti-national or seditious or treasonous, and to describe them as a threat to the country. And what I want to kind of put across is that the truth is very different. And it's not just that protest should be defended. The fact is that popular protest is essential to a democratic society. The truth is that popular protest isn't a threat to democratic societies, and as I'm sure you're all well aware, it is essential to democratic societies, and there has always been protest. It is an integral part of our democratic history, but it's a part of our democratic history that we're not taught. I would even describe it as, so, as we're familiar with the idea that there are 4 pillars of a republic, and that those are the judiciary and the legislature and the executive and the free press. And I want to put across that there is in fact a 5th pillar, which might even be considered a secret pillar, and that is people in the street. It doesn't always appear like an institution, because these are different kinds of people, different parts of a society, and it happens over the course of the life of a country. But if we were to see it as an institution, then we would understand that that we are not taught the history of this institution of protest, and that there are real reasons why we should be. That it needs the reasons that should be part of our formal education as citizens and as free people. And India is a good place to see how this kind of history is hidden from us, and what sorts of marvelous surprises it holds. So now, the other person that I mentioned you would know, let's go back to Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. When I was preparing this talk earlier today, I realized something that I found quite striking and delightful, which is that today is the day that 99 years ago, on this date, March 18th, Mahatma Gandhi was sent to jail for the first time. And he was sent to jail on the charge of sedition, which is a criminal provision, a penal provision that's, number section 124A, which is exactly the same penal provision that has been used to charge or to accuse the climate activist Desha Ravi for supporting the farmers' movement just a couple of weeks ago. So on this day, 99 years ago, Mahatma Gandhi went to jail. And of course, what he was protesting then was the British Raj, the British colonial rule of India, which had dominated India for the previous over a century. This was the beginning of the end. What Gandhi had done was that he had initiated a period of mass protest, which would become fairly famous, of course. And in 1920, he had begun the non-cooperation movement. It's a mild-sounding name, but what the non-cooperation movement did was that it encouraged Indians across the country to essentially boycott different aspects of the government. And this had never happened. This had never happened on a national popular scale before. So people were like burning British goods. They were refusing to participate in British in government courts, and it was there was a Hindi writer at the time who described it and captured the feeling of it. His name is Beni Puri, and he said, "When I recall that era, the non-cooperation movement of 1921, the image of a storm confronts my eyes. From the most humble huts to the highest palaces, from villages to cities, everywhere there was a foment and a loud echo." Now, that non-cooperation movement, that image of a storm that had swept India for 2 years, was abruptly ended by Gandhi in February of 1922. And why had he done that? He did it because of an incident that took place in February, which was called in a little town called Chowri Chowra. Now, what happened over there was that some protest leaders had been arrested and beaten up in jail. This was fairly standard, but with the spirit that was moving people at that moment, a huge procession moved to the police station where the jail was, and kind of surrounded it and demanded their release. Some policemen fired in the air. All of this sounds like it could still be happening, in the present. They fired in the air, but unfortunately the crowd was too strong and too agitated, and it overwhelmed the police station. It chased the policemen inside, liberated their prisoners, and then they set fire to the police station and they killed 24 policemen. Gandhi's commitment and his dedication to nonviolence was so strong that overnight he called off the non-cooperation movement. And he said that we can't deviate from peaceful protest. It was against his principles. And not everyone appreciated that. This movement had held India in its grip for 2 years, and he called it off overnight because of what happened in a small town that nobody had heard of. But in any case, that was Gandhi's attitude and his approach to nonviolence. And despite having done that, a few weeks later, he was convicted of sedition, and he was put in jail for the first time. So these are the images that you might be familiar with, if you have any images that you think of when you think of India and protest. This is India's storied freedom movement in the years leading up to 1947. Now, it would be another 25 years before India was free and before the British actually left. But in those 25 years, Gandhi and his compatriots, many men and women, would sort of seed a global ideal and a global example of nonviolent protest, which was called Satyagraha. That's what he called Satyagraha. But and that example would kind of resonate in the rest of the world for a very long time. One, perhaps the most famous inspiration the effect it had was on Martin Luther King. And in 1964, many years later, when Martin Luther King received the Nobel Peace Prize and gave his speech, he made sure to cite that example. And one of the things he said in that very powerful speech, well worth reading, he said that Negroes of the United States, following the people of India, have demonstrated that nonviolence is not sterile passivity, but a powerful moral force which makes for social transformation. That was in the 60s. And then in the 1980s, this example was guiding much of the movement against apartheid in South Africa. And when Nelson Mandela won the Nobel Peace Prize in his turn in 1993, he made sure to pay his tribute to Gandhi's example and to Martin Luther King's example, building this tradition. So one thing that history of protest shows us is how our societies are linked together through struggles. So that, part of the reason I wanted to talk about this is that a history of protest in India is not a history of protest limited to India. It's very much a history of international solidarity and the ways that ideals and strategies and tactics link people and create sort of these linkages and lineages between movements in different places and different times that can be very powerful. So in fact, India's freedom movement in particular became a form of leadership that inspired many struggles around the world. So over here, when we learn India's modern history, it's entirely a history of protest. It is a history of protest, but only until 1947, only until India's independence. And after that, the subject disappears, right? After that, no curriculum tells us about protest movements that changed the country. After that, what we're learning about is wars that India fought and won, maybe didn't win, and elections. So these are also lessons in how to be citizens, but they're lessons in how to be a particular kind of disciplined and obedient kind of citizen. But obviously, the British getting on a ship and leaving didn't mean that India's struggles were done. It almost meant that India's struggles for social justice had just begun, because now we had a constitution that granted people many important and fundamental rights, but those rights were written down in an important book. They still needed to reach people and become real in people's lives. I want to make sure that I don't go too far over. So Shahan or Yucel, if you can tell me how much time I've been speaking, that would be useful. Anyway.
You've been about 15 minutes, so if you want to go for another 5-10, that leaves us more than enough time.
Okay, great. Right. Well, in independence, so once India is free, of course, protest movements are, we may not learn about them, but they are continuous. In the 60s and the 70s, in 50s and 60s and 70s, many of them are inspired by communism and by the language of international communism. And these tended to be movements for landless farmers against feudal landlords, for industrial workers, and also for Dalits. Dalits is a word chosen by the community that is the sort of most exploited tier of Hindu society. They used to be called untouchables. And Dalits began to come into their empowerment struggle largely in this period. Well, of course, it's much longer, but anyway. And so in this period, we get to see a lovely example of a reverse lineage, which is what happens in the early 1970s. What's happening in the States is that the civil rights movement is proceeding, but many young African Americans are growing impatient with some of the principles of nonviolence and are taking on a more militant attitude towards their self-defense. And that, of course, is the Black Panthers movement. And the Black Panthers movement makes a big splash. And it's in the media, in the international media. In India, Dalits who've kind of lost their legendary leader, Ambedkar, are looking around for an example of how to organize, and they pick up on the Black Panther example in the city of Bombay. And what's born is the Dalit Panthers. And the Dalit Panthers is another incredible and very moving episode of India's history of protest, which we don't learn, which is young Dalit men and women trying to gain inspiration from the struggle for for Black lives in the States in the 60s and 70s, and to replicate that over here. And if you Google Dalit Panthers, one of the images that will jump up is a pamphlet where they've used some of the exact iconography that was published by the Black Panthers. And one of the remarkable things about this is that the Black Panthers movement, I think, didn't last beyond more than a decade, but the Dalit Panthers movement did. So that lineage remains, but it remains more in India, and it doesn't remain in Bombay. The Bombay Dalit Panthers, in turn, inspired a group in Madras, which is called the Vidutulai Chirutaigal Kachi, which literally means the Liberation Panther Party. And they still exist today. And they are one of the foremost voices for Dalit lives and Dalit rights in southern India, even today. So that's an incredible, to me, sort of form of lineage that persists. And now I could probably talk for another 15 minutes, but I don't want to do that to you. There's many moving and powerful protest movements for women's survival and safety, for the environment, and these kind of rise in the 80s and 90s. And of course, the movement for women's safety is still making gains and covering ground today. And Me Too, which of course happened in India as well, is another example of how international linkages and inspirations travel from one place to another. Because as we know, that's another thing that started with in the United States and with African American women. But I'll end on the note that brought me to ask about the history of protest in the first place. Sort of midway through India's journey since independence, in the year 1975, a prime minister named Indira Gandhi declared a state of emergency, which is something countries often do when they go to war, but India was not at war. This was a state of emergency to suppress internal dissent and bring about 16 months of fairly authoritarian government that during which many opposition leaders were put in jail and a lot of protest was impossible. We compare the current day, and it's in the Indian media, it's easy. You'll often hear comparisons of our present government and its turn towards authoritarian sort of decisions, and comparisons to Indira Gandhi's emergency in 1975. But regardless of those, as India's been going through waves and waves of protests recently, first massive student protests, and then the citizenship protest centered on Indian Muslims, which took place last year, and now these farmer protests, which are still underway. All of them have been denounced and kind of framed by national leaders as being anti-national and criminal and seditious. So I got curious and I wondered, most of these leaders, most of our, these senior politicians in the ruling party, they must be like 60, 70 years old, right? So it's like, what were they doing if they think young people protesting is so dangerous and so criminal? What were they doing when they were in college or when they were straight out of college? And of course, as it turned out, in the early 1970s, the very people who are in power, the very people who are central government ministers, and including our prime minister himself, who condemn youth activism and protest and sometimes punish it quite brutally today, they were involved in the most extreme student protests that the country has ever seen in the early 1970s. And many of their political careers were actually launched by those protests. And since then, they've gone to some lengths to suppress that history and to hide the fact that is how their own, how they challenged authoritarian power when they were young. So in short, the men who are denouncing and punishing protesters in India today they were once the young disruptionists and anti-nationals that they now jail people for being. And they don't want young people to know that. What they fear correctly is the angry young energy that they themselves once had. And that, I think, is one of the best reasons, is one of the real reasons why we don't learn a history of protest, and one of the best reasons to discover it for ourselves. So with those opening notes, I would love to talk to you guys and to Yucel.
Thank you for joining us from India for this very enlightening introduction to a history of protest in India. Indeed, as Shahan mentioned, the number of parallels between India and Turkey, current state of affairs in Turkey is well, significant, right? As you were talking about the sort of youth of the current rulers of India, how they were sort of members of the protest movement, etc. It reminded me of the current ruler of Turkey, Erdogan, who was actually jailed for reading a poem when he was the mayor of Istanbul, yet he's now currently the president of Turkey, who jails people for doing the same kind of thing, right? Indeed, quite similar in many ways. I want to sort of return to these citizenship laws, if you don't mind. So if you could say a tiny bit more about the CAA and the NRC, about their nature. What do you think state is trying to do with them? What's the end aim? I think that could get us sort of started in a deeper conversation.
Well, the anti-CAA protest was sparked by the passage of a law in India in December of 2019, which is called the Citizenship Amendment Act. And the Citizenship Amendment Act essentially did this. It created a new fast track to naturalize refugees from other countries nearby with various qualifications of any religion except Muslims. Now, the government created some justifications for this, saying that there are other Muslim countries nearby. Now, it's very significant that we have a Hindu nationalist government in India. That is a polite way of putting it. I think you may want to, since I'm speaking on an international channel, I'll go with the polite way. But there's more severe ways of describing what their ideology is, which are used in India. Their response was that there are other Muslim countries nearby. Why don't Muslim refugees seek refuge there? But the fact is, this was the first time in the history of India that any religious criteria had been added to the terms of what it means to be a citizen. What very senior politicians were also saying, unfortunately, which made it much more sinister and threatening for people, was that the Citizenship Amendment Act was going to be linked to a process by which all Indian citizens would have their citizenship kind of audited. And if you lacked whatever proof was going to be required, then you might essentially be, rendered stateless. And so how this is interpreted, and it's difficult to not interpret it this way, many people in the ruling party said it explicitly, is that while auditing the citizenship of everyone in the country, which would of course be an incredibly chaotic and like painful process, all kinds of people, especially poor people, people who are poor and people who are marginalized, this is India. There are millions of people who can't even read. So the idea of putting anyone through a citizenship test putting everyone through a citizenship test is bizarre. But what was really frightening was the idea that a lot of people might lose their citizenship, and then any non-Muslims would be able to get it back through the CAA. So the short version of what I just said is that there is a sort of citizenship agenda, which increasingly looks like it will be turning the screws on who can qualify as an Indian citizen, and will be excluding Muslims, who are a huge part of India's population, from that. And this caused horror and dismay and resistance on a scale that I have never seen before in my life in India. So it was a kind of a diversity of society of all different religions and all different generations began to take out huge protests in this country, and were essentially what it wasn't just about these laws. Now, these laws kind of were the final straw, but what they were doing, what these protests were signifying from my observation, was that they were saying that India needs to remain an inclusive, an egalitarian, and a secular society where the goal is for different communities to live in some form of harmony. And it's not acceptable for us to envision a society in which any community, any religious community, is going to be increasingly legally excluded and ghettoized. So that was the basis of this enormous protest that took place between December of 2019 and February of 2020, and was frankly very inspiring. It ended up being centered on a gathering of these Muslim Indian women in a working class part of New Delhi called Shaheen Bagh, which was a massive display of patriotism. Now, one of the things that I learned from the CA protest is that you take those opportunities to claim the icons of the nation And those things give you protection. So the CAA protest in Shaheen Bagh they were full of the Indian flag. People, people laid claim to the national anthem. They laid claim to the Constitution, and there were readings of the Constitution, of the preamble, and those became the slogans of this protest. And that was, of course, incredibly powerful. And it was and it just made it that much harder to denounce the protesters as being, traitors, because this is what a nationalist government would prefer, would be to pose this as traitors who hate India. But the protest was partly successful because it claimed all of these icons of the nation from nationalists.
Thank you so much for that. Since we're on the issue of these kinds of exclusions, right, from membership in the nation, a related issue in this regard is something, I guess, the so-called love jihad that I wanted to ask you about that as well. This also, in a way, right, there's sort of, I guess I could follow up with another question, but the way because of one's religious difference, there's sort of a alterous discourse, the othering of Muslims who want to marry a Hindu woman, for example, or seeing them as members of Pakistan, or members of the nation of Pakistan, rather than as members of national members of India. Could you say a little bit more about that as well, please?
Yeah, well, one of the very painful legacies that India lives with is the fact that when the British left, the country and a society was essentially divided in two, and it was that happened for incredibly complicated social and political reasons. But it left us with a legacy of international hatred, sadly, with our closest neighbor. A neighbor we used to have on both sides when Bangladesh was part of Pakistan, and now we just have on one side, but share a very long border with. And both India and Pakistan essentially live with an obsessive kind of paranoia about each other, which is stoked by politics, despite the fact that Indians and Pakistanis are very, very similar and speak the same languages, are very hard to tell apart from looking at them. And if you go on like Pakistani TikTok, or there's Pakistanis have much more in common with many North Indians than many North Indians have with South Indians, that kind of thing. So anyway, we can't spend too much time on partition, but the reason Hindu nationalism has gained this sway in India is partly because of the ways it has been ready to salt that wound again and again, and keep reopening wounds that have to do with the divide between Hindus and Muslims, rather than closing those wounds. And one way it does that is with the concept of love jihad. Now, as things move along in the current regime, and I mean the social regime, people are finding more and more very frightening ways to create paranoia about Muslims, who are a large but very vulnerable kind of marginalized minority in India. So when the coronavirus came around here, a lot of TV channels were broadcasting about Corona Jihad, which was the claim that Muslims had kind of orders from religious leaders to go around and spread the coronavirus because of just malice, I suppose. And of course, this was the worst kind of fake news, but Corona Jihad was a thing. So increasingly, you can attach jihad to any sort of trending topic and create a new trope of paranoia and persecution. And the most popular one is love jihad, which is the idea that Muslim men are organized and deployed to seduce and convert Hindu women in India, and thereby turn more of India into an Islamic society. There's no evidence of this, and again, courts have kind of examined it and ruled that that love jihad isn't a thing. But it's such a powerful sort of form of social poison, essentially, that people don't hesitate from using it when they need that kind of thing. So sadly, the anti-CAA protest, what's called the anti-CAA protest, which I call and should have been calling the citizenship protests, is really just a protest against that kind of discourse, not just laws and not just constitutional amendments, but against a kind of discourse that is so vicious and so out to set people against each other, especially to set a Hindu majority against a very vulnerable Muslim minority. Yeah.
It reminds me of anti-miscegenation laws in this country, for sure, but earlier.
That's right.
In the century. So it's really weird to see some of these things that we hope were left behind to reappear in India, in other parts of the world, in fact, in Turkey. I'll ask one quick question as well. I don't want to bring up Kashmir because that's such a big subject, and we're sort of running out of time. But since we're on the issue of sort of, in a way, nationalism as well, and some of my students are here, those who took my Modern Turkey course, some of them read actually articles on renaming or Turkification of old sort of Kurdish, Arabic, Armenian, Greek places in Turkey.
Mm-hmm.
And something like this is happening also in India too, but I don't exactly know the extent of it, right? So we can give the sort of the example of Bombay, and I notice you say Bombay rather than Mumbai. So could you say just a few words about this as well? Then after that, I think we can go to audience asking questions as well.
Okay, fantastic. If you don't mind, Yucel, I will say something about Kashmir, because I think I have something to share about Kashmir that brings us back to the history of protest. What I'll say about the renaming of Bombay and of other places is that these are, there's a whole slew of regionalized kind of ethnic movements, which are also, protest movements and have their own validity sometimes. That demand recognition for regional cultures. And that's part of why Bombay, which is an anglicized colonial name, got renamed as Mumbai. Being an anglicized colonial, sort of colonially influenced person, probably, Bombay feels natural to me. But I was also referring to, I was referring to the city in the colonial period and before the name was legally changed. I would refer to it as Mumbai in the last few decades. What I want to say about Kashmir is just this. Many of you guys won't be aware, but late in 2019, the Indian government essentially suspended the democratic system in the state of Jammu and Kashmir, which is the state that's most pulled apart by this old legacy of partition, and is the only state that's majority Muslim in the country. And not only did they kind of shut down, they kind of collapsed the constitutional status of the state, which was a guarantee that the state had received back in the day. And it is no longer a state, in fact, and now it's just like two provinces administered by the central government directly. They also threw practically every elected representative into house arrest for the better part of a year with no explanation and no criminal charges. And they shut down internet and mobile services for months and months and months in the entire region of Kashmir. Now, because Indians are trained to view Kashmir as being a problem state, the way I've always described this is Kashmir is like that problem sibling at the table. And what happened in August of 2019 is that dad got up and grabbed, the sibling, and threw them into the basement and locked the basement and came back and sat at the table. And the rest of us who were sitting there were like, then you had to decide what you were going to do. Were you going to tell dad that that's not okay, or were you going to accept that they were always kind of problematic and maybe needed some heavy-handed discipline? So that was sort of what happened to Kashmir. I think that works as an analogy, and it's what it felt like, because the rest of us, life went on, and you could just eat your dinner. But what I realized from historical example and from the history of protest again is that measures to, part of the history of protest is the history of measures to suppress protests and to suppress people's assertion. And a rule, what I would almost call a historical rule or principle, is that measures to suppress protest and to suppress people that are used and seem legitimate in the periphery of a state, in the kind of the edges of a state where there's often trouble, those measures always come home. So this is something you saw in, when in the imperial age, techniques and systems were used against colonial people that were legally barred from ever being used against Europeans. And one of those was aerial bombing. Right through the 1920s and 1930s, aerial bombing, which is literally planes dropping bombs, was barred by treaty for Europeans to use against each other. And it was just understood that this is something that you just use against rebellious colonial people. But we know what happened once the World War started. It all came home, and then we had Dresden. The same thing happens in different forms, even in modern nation states. And what I went around saying to young people then was, look, just be aware that it always comes home. And when the anti-CAA protest, when the citizenship protest started in December of that year, so the Kashmir internet shutdown happened in August, and it lasted well into 2020. In December of 2019, when the protests were so big and kind of really sweeping major Indian cities, the government started shutting down mobile networks and internet networks in Indian cities, in major Indian cities, even in the heart of New Delhi, just as ways to disrupt protests. And this is difficult. I mean, it's really hard to, and it's frightening to go into a potentially dangerous encounter with police, and your mobile phone won't work. I was in Bombay, and my girlfriend was in Delhi, and she was visiting these protests, and I knew that as she moved closer, there would be no way to reach her. And it's shocking the first time it happens, but it happened just as one might have predicted, which is that the system that was deployed first in the peripheries and seemed maybe justifiable and maybe necessary quickly came, and within just months was being used in the national capital itself.
Somebody from the audience says, just to clear this, and I have a follow-up on this one as well, wanted to know the distinction between the farmer protest and the Dalit protests as well. I think you can do this very quickly. And the garden workers protest from Assam.
Oh, well, what's happening, the farmers protest is a fairly complicated phenomenon, which is a little bit harder to resolve into black and white than the citizenship protest, for example. But at least in terms of the policy that's at the heart of it, the right to protest is one that that they're still entitled to just as much, and that is sort of become what the protests have been about, is their right to not be suppressed and pushed away from demonstrating in Delhi. But the farmers' protest is concentrated in the northwest of India among farmers that are relatively privileged compared to much more impoverished parts of the countryside. And there's probably too much complexity to say how that intersects with Dalits, except to say that the farmers' unions that are behind these protests have gone through a really historic effort to make these unified and to involve not just people who, farmers who own land. So it's not just a peasants' protest, but it's also an agricultural workers' protest. It's unifying people who own the farms with the people who want to work the farms. Obviously, there's a lot of conflict between them regularly, along with other forms of marginalized, other unions of marginalized people. So there's a coming together of people who are otherwise easily pitched against each other and whose interests may be at odds. But as for the tea workers' protest in Assam, I'm afraid I don't know enough about it, shame to say. There's a lot happening in Assam right now because there's an election that is very high stakes. And so it's hard to keep up.
So a question then, follow up on the citizenship laws, right? So that we don't necessarily divide the Indian population of India into Muslims and Hindus.
And everyone else, yes.
Right, diametrically opposed as well. So one of my students, actually, a good question here, I'll read at least parts of it. The question is, what about those Hindus who resist the Citizenship Act? So those who understand that this is an oppressive law, et cetera, so that we see that there is an overlap of interest in terms of people's liberties.
Oh, well, I have met a lot of them, and most of the Hindus I know are very much in that camp. And I would say that it was never possible to count, but at a certain point the protest was as much, and I can't really emphasize this enough because I'd never seen it before, but the movement against these laws, while it was definitely centered, the heart of it and the kind of the core of it was providing the real dedication and the courage, were Muslim Indians. I've seen protests taken out against these laws by trans folk and queer folk in Bombay. I've seen taken out by army veterans and ex-servicemen, by lawyers in the High Court of New Delhi, by academics, obviously, by students of every campus of every. The protest movement itself manifested its best aspirations by including everyone, and it was part of what made it quite beautiful to behold was that it looked like the society in some ways that it was defending, in a way that even our society is often very divided, but in those protest moments it looked like it's like the best version of itself, and Shaheen Bagh was one of the places where it did that. So beneath the Indian flag, what I observed was an incredible gathering in a very sort of unattractive corner of New Delhi, I have to say. So this wasn't like going to Central Park. It was a gathering of people around these working class Muslim women to offer their support, their protection, and their endorsement. And those people included pop stars and musicians and poets and people from every corner of the country speaking many different languages. So you can see what it was about that was easy to be moved by, and was also, I should say, part of the reason why the government was so threatened by it was that this movement was actually very successful in its goals. It was successful in reappropriating national icons. It was successful in unifying people that Hindu nationalism wants to see divided. And it was successful in moving other governments internationally. There was a great deal of response. This was, it was condemned by the United States Congressional Committee on International Religious Freedom. It was condemned by the European Commission, or there was a motion to condemn it by in the European Parliament. It was debated in the British House of Lords. So this movement was interesting because it was successful. And in order for it to be shut down, what had to happen was that essentially under murky circumstances, a riot between sort of Hindu nationalist gangs and some of these protesters erupted. It just erupted and spread through a vulnerable part of New Delhi. And then that riot became the basis for locking up a lot of the leaders of the citizenship protest. So even after the riot, the Shaheen Bagh and many of these protest sites persisted, and then the coronavirus pandemic began. And so that put I would not say a full stop, but a comma on the movement.
We have a question about how the government is justifying in terms of what the farmers are protesting. Would you be able to say a few things on that, please?
Yeah, I think that the easiest way to describe the government's justification is to say that the system of agricultural markets and procurement and pricing was very flawed before the new laws. It was very flawed and it was environmentally destructive, and therefore was in fact in need of revision, of reforms. Ideally, of course, you would think, or the only way to do that would be to get a lot of consultation and to speak to a lot of farmer unions, to get people on board and figure out what a new law should look like and what a new, more sustainable system would look like. Instead, what the government did was it kind of, in the middle of the pandemic, it passed these laws that seemed to many farmers to be a way of privatizing the procurement system in a way that would make companies close to the government very, very rich indeed, and farmers poorer. So that is the basis of the farmers' resistance. And the basis of the government's defense is the system before is bad. If you're defending the system before, you're a hypocrite. And even if we steamrolled it through parliament using, defying all of our legislative conventions, then it's the law passed by the government, and you can protest it up to a point, and after that point you are going to be in trouble. So now we're in the trouble point, and the backlash against Rihanna for her very mild tweet, for Greta Thunberg, for a young woman. Now, not only were many farmers have many farmers been injured, but I think it captures something that a 21-year-old woman who's a climate activist in Bombay, who edited a Google document that was essentially like ways to support the farmers' protest, was charged with sedition and put in jail for several days or weeks. And only, she still has those charges against her, but she's luckily got bail. So that's, now we're in the backlash mode. And unfortunately, it just means that a very, very important conversation about the ideal way to design, the agricultural system is not happening because the government doesn't want to have it.
Right. Okay. So, inspired by your comment about student protests, a student asks here, this is a multi-part question, but I'm going to try to combine it. So he suggests that possibility, or asks about the possibility, this is more of an opinion question, I suppose, integrating protest into curriculums in sort of starting even at earlier education, right? So he wonders whether this would create a protest elite, or would it be more beneficial to a democratic society to institute that curriculum in primary education to perhaps sport an egalitarian mode of protest that obviously takes everybody's sort of rights and liberties into account?
Well, I really like the question. I think the question contains as much as my answer is likely to do. And one thing I'll say is that the only thing worse than a protest elite is a non-protest elite, which is what you're liable to get the rest of the time. So I think that whether we're integrating protest into the curriculum or yeah, I think there are ways. Well, yes, the answer is yes, absolutely. It's a right, it's an obligation, it's a critical tool of democratic not just citizenship, but of governance. It's an important part of governance because many of the best parts of our constitution don't actually get executed unless there are popular protests driving them, and that's the history of protest for the most part. But there are many things that we also need to learn in order to avoid the dangers and the possibilities in which protest oversteps. I mean, I can't be completely idealistic because protest actions are adjacent to vandalism, to insurgency, often to riots. It's harder to negotiate how we stage protest movements, and if we don't know anything about, if there's something that we're not taught about, and similarly, it's much easier for the government to blur how protest movements are actually being carried out if people in general don't understand those distinctions. If we don't understand protest as a constitutional entitlement and necessity, then it's easy to call all of them, the entire debate that happened in the United States last year, for instance, of course, between, are these protesters or are these rioters? And it was so divisive, it just lacked so many fundamentals, and it lacked so much, even among the elite, it lacked so much fundamental understanding about what that distinction means and how we're supposed to judge it, rather than just like treat it as a language game, which is like, okay, we keep calling it riot and we make it bad. We keep calling it protest and we make it good. That's hopeless. We need to be undergirding all of this with better understanding and with better concepts. And we learn about wars, and learning about wars, we learn about so much about wars, and that helps us understand the distinction between wars of aggression and self-defense. There's something similar we need to be able to understand about protests, which is to understand the subtleties between what is enabling social justice and what might be undermining it.
What you're saying also applies to comments by a US Senator recently about the attack on the Capitol, who suggested that he was not threatened or felt fear because of these terrorists attacking, but he might have been afraid had it been the Black Lives Matter protesters. So it was the same kind of thing when these things were happening in the US. Depending on ideological sort of stand of people who looked at this, partially obviously uninformed about what was being asked, what was sort of being demanded. Sort of in many ways, this also reminds me of the Muslim protests or anti-citizenship laws protests in India, that a lot of people who were uninformed were seeing these as riots, whereas obviously a lot of these started as peaceful protests, and outsiders became involved to drive it into a different sort of direction.
Yes.
Would you have anything to say about the protest in this country, maybe?
The protests in the States?
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, Black Lives Matter, for example.
Yes. I feel like I should be listening to someone on that end rather than telling you my opinion from Delhi. But what I will say is that as a general point is that part of the reason that we studied a history of protest is to understand that protest movements are messy, and expecting any protest to either remain fully within the bounds of sometimes whatever of civic rectitude or the law is sometimes just unrealistic. Now, it's everyone's obligation to follow the law, and I'm endorsing that. But I'm speaking as a historian and saying that many of the protests that we admire were messy. Many of the people who we now hold as heroes, and Martin Luther King would be one of them, Muhammad Ali would be another one, and there's countless over here in India, were once denounced and demonized because it was messy, and they were deemed to have crossed the lines. I mean, people used to demonize Martin Luther King, and so that tells you something about where you stand in the present day. I would say that, and yeah, I suppose I do want to point out that your original comment, your initial comment was very germane to India, because one of the first things the Prime Minister said when the citizenship protests began was, he said, he said in a kind of grim tone, he said, you can recognize them by their clothes. He was talking about the people who are breaking the law and throwing stones and kind of attacking police, and he said you can recognize them by their clothes. And what the subtext of that was very clear. He was saying that this is what happens when Muslims protest, but it's historically and conceptually completely false. It was also false that the only people protesting were Muslims, as I said earlier, but it was important for them to put about that fiction, because it automatically began the process of discrediting the protests.
Raghu, it was an absolute pleasure to host you here today. And I think you spoke in ways to the issue that really, like I said in the beginning, resonates here on our campus. And I think people took a lot away from this conversation, even in most oblique references. I think you were sometimes talking about what is going on here in Richmond, on our campus in the United States. So thank you very much for sharing all your thoughts today. And Yucel, thank you very much for hosting today's discussion and keeping up with the technology, which seemed to be a challenge.
Thank you. It really is an honor.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. It was all ours. And thank you all for attending and joining us today. Hope to see you soon sometime. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.